Good morning. As we're looking at the book of Acts, we're at the point of listening to Stephen's speech today. I think I'll refer to him more as Stephen than Stephen. But there's a Stephen Ministries that is taught and followed, and it's a Bible study type deal, and it's based after it's named for this man who was one of the seven chosen by the apostles to take care of the people. But this Stephen was very powerful in his proclaiming Jesus as Messiah, as Lord and Savior, and very strong in the Spirit, it had told us. And the priesthood and others had stirred up false witnesses against him. And we find him as we begin chapter 7. We read 21 verses today, just not quite half of it. But we find Stephen in front of the high priest, and the high priest says, "What have you to say for yourself? Talk about your defense right now. You've been accused. What do you say?" And so the question, as Luke writes it, are these things so? Are they telling the truth? And rather than just come out and say, "No, these are lies," Stephen begins to tell the story of the Jewish people. And he says, "Brother and fathers, listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our brother Abraham." So he's going way back in history to Abraham and how Abraham and Sarai were childless. He doesn't get into all of the details, but he's talking about Abraham and the birth of Isaac, and then the birth of Jacob, and how Jacob had 12 sons who become he calls them the 12 patriarchs. They become the 12 tribes of Israel. And then the 13th boy is born, Joseph. And the 12 who are the patriarchs become jealous of Joseph. Stephen is telling the story, and he's remembering the history that he's been taught since he was a child. And so he tells the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then of Joseph, and the 12 patriarchs, 12 sons, and the selling of Joseph into slavery, and how Joseph rose to a high position in Egypt, and then how the famine comes, the drought comes, and how Jacob, who becomes Israel, that's who we know him as, the father of Israel, the father of the 12 patriarchs, the 12 tribes of Israel, that way of the Jewish faith. But Joseph is raised up to a high position of over the storage and preparations for the drought and for the famine that's upcoming, because of his ability to interpret dreams that God has given to him. So Stephen tells this story of that, and how he says, the patriarchs, jealous of Joseph, sold him, this jealousy. And so I think part of Stephen's telling of the story is to show that, there was jealousy of Jesus because of his teaching, because of, people going to follow him rather than to follow me, and it was, and even within the disciples of Jesus, they would say to Jesus, "Well, there's a person over there doing something in your name. Should we, And Jesus says, "No." So the disciples of Jesus were kind of jealous for Jesus that way. But, it was because of jealousy. Stephen points out that the older brothers sold the youngest brother into slavery. And then that because of this selling of Joseph into slavery, how later during the famine, during the drought and the tough years, the second trip that the brothers came to get provisions is when Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. And then after that, his father came as well. And in verse 15, it says, "So Jacob went down to Egypt." Jacob is Joseph's father, and just this Joseph that we're talking about today is the Joseph of the coat of many colors. It's not the Joseph of Joseph and Mary, the parents of Jesus. There's many generations between this Joseph and the Joseph and Mary of Jesus' birth story. But it says that, when Joseph sent and invited his father Jacob and all of his relatives to come. 75 in all. And I think about 75? He's got 12 sons. And there's only 75. If the 12 sons were married, that's 24. And I guess if they each had 2 kids, that'd be, but they had lots more. But anyway, 75 doesn't sound like a very big number of people of Jacob's family that would have gone to Egypt, but that's what we're told. And this number of 75 that went down there, by the time the Israelites had been there and been enslaved for over 40 years, there were different reports will say up to 5 million Jews that were freed, or Israelites that were freed from slavery and captivity in Egypt, later. But the time of fulfillment comes, that the people in Egypt increased and multiplied, and then it says until another king who didn't know Joseph took the Israelites and made them slaves and made them captives, and then what we find today, kind of the end of our story of what we read today, is at that time Moses was born. He was beautiful before God for 3 months. His mother took care of him, and there was a decree at that point in time that all of the Israelite male children, must be, put to death. They were not to survive that way. But Moses was, we know the story, how his mother hid him, and the Egyptian princess found him and raised him. And this is where we end today. Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and brought him up as her own son. So here's Stephen is telling the history of the Jewish people. And this history is something that every Jewish man, woman, and child knew. It was very important. The story of the Passover, when they would celebrate the Passover meal, it was the youngest child who would ask the question. And the father, the head of the family at that, specifically, would answer the questions. And everybody was involved in the story, the history, because these things were important. And this is why we today have Sunday school for our kids. We gather for worship, because the story of our faith is important, and it's important that our kids know these stories. And on our Sunday morning lectionary that we follow, we don't hear many of the Old Testament stories in that 3-year cycle that comes through. But in Sunday school, we touch on a lot of those. And I think it's so important that we teach the history not only of our Christian faith, but also of the Jewish faith, because we come from that. And it's just like, in school. We learn of our nation's history. And I wasn't really a real history buff, but I appreciate knowing about, the Vikings and the people that came to America many years before, and how Columbus came, and the other explorers, people from England and France and Spain. Those were the 3 major power countries, in the 1500s. And it was those people that came and began to settle our country. And part of the reasoning was for religious freedom, for freedom from persecution. And they came, and people from, Ireland came, and Germans from Russia came. And I think about here in North Dakota, you can go down around the Wishoot-Gackle area, and that's, predominantly Germans have settled in that area. You go up to the northeastern part of the state, Mountain, Garter, and, there's 7 communities up there that are a very dense population of Icelandic people. And they have a celebration every year, the Deuce of August. And one year, I don't know if they call him the King of Iceland or the Prime Minister of Iceland, but there have been times that royalty from Iceland, people of the leaders, have come to this little town of Mountain and Garter, 90 people in Mountain, huge metropolis. But when they have this celebration, their cars are parked 4 or 5 miles out of town, and they've got buses bringing people because of the traditions, the heritage, to keep the heritage alive. We have a big celebration in Minot, Hoostfest, Hustafest, however you want to say it, celebrating the heritage of the Norwegians, because it's important that we remember our roots. And it's with our Native Americans as well. They carry on their traditions because where we come from is important. What our history is important, so that we maybe won't make quite so many of the same mistakes. So Stephen, in his speech, of which we heard about half of it today, is reminding the high priest and the others that are gathered there that throughout the history of Israel, throughout the history of the Jewish faith, they had rejected God many times. They had rejected, the leaders that God had set up. How Joseph was sold into slavery, and Moses came through the waters, and how God provided for these two men, especially Joseph and Moses. In how like the brothers had tried to put Joseph to death. The king of Egypt would have had Moses put to death, but God was faithful and God provided. And we didn't get to the Passover today, but that's a part of Moses' story of the freeing of the slaves of Egypt from Egypt and the passing that way. And so Stephen knew all of these stories, and he knew the stories in the promise of the Messiah. And he's using this speech to remind the high priests, those gathered there, that so many times in the history of the Jewish nation, they had turned away from God. They had rejected the one that God had chosen, and it's like King David as well, all of the other sons had paraded along, and it was, nope, that's not the one. Nope, that's not the one. Nope, that's not the one. Well, don't you have another? Well, there's this youngest one, Yep, he was the one. So often God has provided and led his people. And so this is why it's important for us to know where we come from, what our heritage is, what our history is. And, to know our nationality is important, but to know our Christianity and where it comes from and why we believe in Jesus as Lord and Savior. And it's just, these wonderful stories that are reminders. I mean, Stephen's story doesn't end in a wonderful way, and we'll find that out tomorrow. And I'll probably be on maybe at 7:30 tomorrow morning, because auctioneering crews and stuff are going to be showing up about 8. But anyway, we need to know our history. We need to know our heritage. And we hear in Stephen's speech to the high priest, we find out that the Jewish people teach their heritage to their children, and they know where they come from. And that's important for us to remember and to teach our children and our grandchildren today the stories of Jesus, the story of God and God's faithfulness. So may you know and live in God's faithfulness again today.